Hi, I'm Lisa Johnston Hancock, a children's book illustrator, artist, and art educator. And in this short video, I'll be showing you some watercolor techniques to create texture in your illustrations. I'll show you my favorite watercolor brand, my favorite watercolor brushes, and the various papers that I like to use for my illustrations. I'll be showing you several different exercises after we learn some basic techniques, and you can either paint along with me in real time, or you can save this video and you can do the exercises at home on your own. So let's take a look at the art supplies that we'll use while we're painting. Okay, so let's talk about supplies. This is Arches watercolor paper. It's 140 pound, and that means that you have a less chance of it buckling once you start doing watercolor washes. It has 12 sheets of paper in this pad, and this is a pretty good size. It's 10 by 14. They make them in various sizes. They also make them in what's called a watercolor block, where the edges are going to be glued together, and then you actually cut the pieces off with like a palette knife. I like this paper because it has a lot of tooth to it. It's groovy, it's a textured paper, and if you look at it, you can actually feel the texture, so it's really nice. The paint goes across. With watercolor paper, watercolor paint, you want a paper that has a little bit of a texture to it to actually hold the watercolor in, and that gives you beautiful texture when it dries. Next, we'll talk about the Arches paper that they sell individually. This is the Arches Aquarelle. Ooh, that's hard to say. I say that 10 times fast. I like to buy this in larger sheets, and then I cut it down into smaller sheets. And you can actually see, I don't know if you can see it here, but you can actually see the imprint of the arches on the correct side that you should paint on. It's okay if you accidentally paint on the back side, but you definitely will see a little bit of a difference if you don't paint on the correct side. Okay, so that's the paper. Next, we'll talk a little bit about watercolors. So this is my favorite brand. People have different brands that they like. I've just found that this one, I feel like the pigment is really, really pure. I like this one. It's called Sennelier. I also use Holbein, so we'll talk about that in a minute too. This is great for painting out in real life, like landscape painting. Plein air painting is what it's called. So this is a great little palette to take out plein air painting with you or sketching, because it also has a palette in here. So you can get your paint and then you can mix here. Okay, with watercolor paint, you actually it can dry and then it activates again once you get it wet. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. You also need, I had it right here, here we go, a paper towel and a cup of water. And I'll show you how you can activate the dry watercolor once it's dried out. You just take a wet brush like so, and then say we take this bright green right here, and once you wet it, it activates it. Some people like to take a spray water bottle and spray all the paint. I just go one at a time with whatever I'm using. You can get it started here on your palette if you want. If you don't want it to be as intense, then you want to add more water. Okay, then it's ready to go. Once you've activated it, it's ready to go. And the good thing about watercolor is that it is already here. You don't have to worry about it drying up. If it dries up, you just activate it again with watercolor. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. Okay, so the other thing is you might want watercolor in a tube. It's just a personal preference, really. If you're traveling, doing some plein air painting, the little palette like this might come in handy, because then you don't have to worry about carrying around these individual tubes. That's one benefit of this type of watercolor palette. But a lot of people like the ones in the tube as well. It's just a personal preference, I think. This is one of my favorite colors because I love orangey red colors. This one is called Vermilion, and this brand is Holbein. So my two favorite brands are Holbein and Sennelier, both two words that are really difficult to say. All right, So if you don't have one of these that has its own palette, then you might want to have your own palette. And I've been using this for years and years. This is called a butcher's palette. And it has like a nice coating on it. It also has, the middle of it is raised, and then the edges dip down a little bit so that you can put your paint right along here. And then as you add water, it'll kind of pool into this area right here. Or you can just put it wherever you want and add water. You know, people use it different ways. All right, so I'm going to show you just the difference between how you might do it with a tube. So if you're going to use the tube watercolor, you just put a little drop out because a little bit of watercolor goes a long way. So you don't want to waste the paint. So you just put a little tiny pea-sized amount like this. And then again, you take your water, you get it activated. Of course it's wet because it came out of the tube. And you make your little wash. And then we will test it out over here. Okay, so we have our watercolor paints, we have our papers, we talked about our palette, our watercolor cup, and now I just want to make sure that we talk about brushes a little bit. So this is a number 2 Princeton, it's Neptune is the brand. You always want to keep your watercolor brushes at a point like this, and I usually keep them while I'm working in a cup like this so they stay upright. Another favorite is this Danube. Oop. It's been so used that the words are rubbed off, but it's a number 6, and I love this brush. Another one that you might see me using is this tiny one that goes in my little travel watercolor palette. It's a Sennelier brush number 3. And all of these that I'm showing you are natural hair brushes. So that means it's just maybe some kind of animal hair. They also make synthetic brushes, and those are good too. I have a synthetic brush that I like and I use all the time. This is a silver black velvet, and that just means it's not real hair. Synthetic brush number 4. Okay, so I think we're about ready to get started. That's all of your supplies that you'll need. Oh, you might also want a pencil and an eraser. So any kind of pencil is fine. I like Blackwing pencil, but when I am doing my illustrations, I actually like to use like a light, let me see where I put it over here, like a light HB pencil. Because the H is not going to be very dark at all. It's just a really light line. You can make it darker, but then you can erase it. So I just keep it super light. And that way, if you want, you can erase your pencil lines, or you can leave your pencil lines. Some people like that. It shows movement. Okay, so let's move on to the first exercise. You want to figure out whatever paper you want to use. You want to make sure that you have it on the correct side. And then you want to take your masking tape and tape down your paper. And this is going to do 2 things. Number 1, this is going to keep it in place while you're working on it. And number 2, it helps to keep the paper from buckling when you start to do washes later on. And this paper, this is Arches 140-pound paper, so it's a little bit thicker. Arches makes heavier paper. They make 300-pound paper if you wanted to do that. I used to work with that when I would do commission portraits because it just really keeps the paper from buckling. It's almost like you're working on a thick canvas. The paper is so thick. So that's an option too later on as you become more advanced in your painting. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to test out each one of our colors, and I'm going to be using my plein air palette just to make things easier. So my first color is a nice lemon yellow, and I'm going to, I got it good and activated, and I'm just going to get my first little swatch here. Okay. Rinse my brush, then I'll take the next color and I'll do another little swatch. And I'm going to keep going until I have it fully covered. For the sake of time, I'm just going to show you, whoops, right here. So what you want to do is you want to get every single color so you can see how beautiful each color looks when it's on top of this white cold press paper. And here you can see the next exercise that we're going to be doing. So after you've completed all of your colors in your palette that you have, you can make a note of what each one is if you want to. Like take a pencil and write lemon yellow if that's what you want to do. But I really just want you to see what each color looks like when you actually put it down on paper. Because watercolor, it looks a little different when it's wet, and then sometimes it will look darker or lighter once it dries. Like this one here. This is, I think this might be alizarin crimson here, and you can see it looks pretty dark. But when you look at the pigment here, it's actually much darker than the pigment here. So that gives you an idea of what it's going to look like when you put it on paper. All right, so the first little exercise that we're going to do along with this one, once you've got all of your paints, is we're going to create a value scale, just like this, with only 2 colors. And these are the 2 colors that we're going to do for our still life exercise that we're going to do next. All right, so after you have all of your colors out and you've got them all up here, I'm going to move on just for the sake of time. I'm going to take alizarin crimson, not alizarin crimson, I'm sorry, ultramarine blue, because we're going to do blue and orange. This is ultramarine blue. Get it good and activated. I'll even come down here. Make sure that you coat your brush. You've got a lot of pigment on your brush. And then I'm going to do a little square right here. All right. Then I'm going to rinse my brush, and I'm going to take my cadmium orange, and I'm going to get it good and activated. I'm going to come down here, coat my brush, and I'm going to go to the other side over here. You just want to leave a little bit of space in between. Okay, so what I'm going to do to get my values is I'm going to start with my cadmium orange, and then I'm just going to add a touch of ultramarine blue. And you see I'm rinsing my brush every time, you know that. I'm rinsing my brush every time. Get a little touch of that, and then I'm going to put it in my orange. This is probably going to be too dark for the first one. So I'm going to make another value right here with my cadmium orange, and we'll try something like that. You always want to start with the lightest and then go a little bit darker. Because once you've made it too dark, you can't get it light again. There are things you can do, you can scrub into it, but it never looks the same. Watercolor is not that forgiving. All right, so I'm just going to add a little more blue to this that I had here. And see how it starts to make a really nice brown? And I'm just going to keep adding. Sorry, today is garbage day. So the garbage trucks are outside making lots of noise. But thank you, garbage trucks, for coming and picking up our garbage. All right, add a little more blue. And see how it starts to make a really beautiful purple? Who would have thought that with orange and blue? It's crazy. Orange and blue are complementary colors, and that means that they are across from each other on the color wheel. So if you mix them, they're going to make some really nice grays, browns. Okay, so before we move on to our little still life study that we're going to do today, I just wanted to show you a couple neat things about watercolor. So there's a technique called wet on dry, and that's what we were doing here when we were just taking the wet paint and we were putting it on dry paper. But there's also wet on wet, and that's when you might see a little bit of color here because I need to get some new water. That's something you might have to do often too. And this is a technique we're going to use when we paint our orange in just a minute. This is called wet on wet. So I'm wetting the paper just with clear water. And then I'll take my orange, my cadmium orange, and you can see how if I stay within this water, how fun is that? It just is not going to go anywhere else on the paper. It's just going to stay right here where I put the water. Is that not cool? It's probably my favorite thing about watercolor. And then you can practice taking one of your mixtures with ultramarine and watch this. Ooh, look at that. So cool. If you take one of my other classes, we'll talk a little more about chiaroscuro and light. Chiaroscuro just means light and dark. Chiro meaning light, scuro meaning dark. Ooh, that's so pretty. Okay, the next exercise will be painting our orange. Stay tuned. Okay, so for our final exercise, we're just going to be painting a simple orange. And if you don't have an orange, you can use whatever you have. Any, like a circle even, would be good. So what we're going to do first is we're just going to get a feel for our brushes. So I want you to just quickly take your orange maybe, and I just want you to see wet on dry. If you need another piece of paper, grab another piece of paper. And just practice doing skinny lines, practice doing fat lines. If this orange had a leaf and I wanted to do a leaf or something, I might take my larger number 6 brush. And I'm just going to use the 2 colors that we have here. And you want to do a leaf, you would barely press down, then press down a little bit harder, and then you're going to pull up and kind of twist it. And that's how you get a really pretty leaf. Okay, so just practice a few little brush strokes like this. Maybe practice if I put a little more pigment into it. And I do the same thing. I'm going to barely press down, then press down harder, and then pull up. And you see what happens, and maybe it pulls a little bit. And what I love about this brush too that's really beautiful is it's a natural haired brush, and it has a great point to it. And when you press down, it gets kind of this little jagged edge on it, like a leaf would really look. All right, so to do your orange, you want to just sketch out a nice little circle here. Pay attention to which way the light is coming from. It's called your light source. So the orange that I'm working from, I have 2 light sources because I'm trying to put enough light here for you all to see what I'm doing. But I'm gonna go with, ooh, okay, let me see if maybe I can turn this down a little bit. Can you still see? You can still see, okay. And also my angle, you're viewing from above, I'm at an angle a little more like this. So whichever angle you're painting from, that's what you wanna be drawing. Okay, then I see a nice little shadow coming this way. And we are just gonna be using blue and orange. Another thing that I find handy that I keep close by is a dryer. So if you have a dryer, you might want to keep that close by, or you just get up, you go make yourself some tea, and then you come back and you're ready to paint again. All right, so we're going to start with cadmium orange. I'm going to do what we did first. We're going to wet the paper with clear water after you make your little sketch. And it was just a simple sketch you saw me do with my pencil. Simple little sketch. We did the shadow. I'm not putting clear water into the shadow just yet. I'm just doing it where the orange is gonna go. And then I'm gonna take my orange and I'm gonna start out a little light. So I don't know if you can see that. Let me pull this down a little more. I added a little more water to this so that I can get what's called, oops, a little wash. So don't go into that, because if you do, if you come out a little bit, you saw I dropped that water droplet, it'll bleed. So you just kind of make sure you don't do that. But this is practice. So don't get down on yourself. Don't, you know, give yourself a break, especially if this is the first time you've ever done anything with watercolor. Give yourself a break. All right, watercolor is fun. It can also be frustrating, but I love the, now you can hear my cat machine going off in the background maybe. We're just full of interesting things going on today. All right, so this is where you can do wet on wet. I'm looking at my orange. I'm seeing that it's a little bit darker on the right side here. So I'm gonna take one of my mixtures where I did ultramarine blue and a touch of orange, because you can mix in the palette or you can mix here on the paper and kind of, oh, you see where that water droplet was? That's a happy accident. All right, so then I'm just gonna go all along this side here. Kind of let it bleed a little bit. Comes up on this edge, but I want to keep it lighter here because that's where my light source is. All right. So I am going to dry this with my hairdryer and I'll be right back. Okay, so I dried this with my hairdryer and you can see that it's much lighter. So I'm going to take my cadmium orange and actually, let's see, okay. And I'm going to put another layer on top here. And now you can see that I'm using the wet on dry technique. But I just wet my brush and I'm going to soften these edges. I'm going to practice softened edges versus hard edges. Okay. If you ever lose your light area that you wanted, you can just take a paper towel and gently blot, and that'll lift it a little bit. But you don't want to do it too much. You just lift it a little bit so it softens. Takes that light out, boom, you're done. Don't keep doing it because you might get a little carried away. All right, so I put a wet on dry, but now I want to put a little more of that shadow in there. The layer is still wet, so I'm going to take a little bit of my blue again, and I'm going to kind of let it bleed on the edges here. See a little bit there. Okay. And I'm just going to soften that edge slightly. That's where my highlight is, right there. My highlight, where the light's hitting it from that direction. All right, so again, I'm going to take my hairdryer and dry it. Okay, I checked it and it feels dry. So I'm going to next work on the shadow. So I see a little touch of orange in the shadow here because it's a white bottom, but I'm going to show you how to do some mixing on the paper. So should we do wet on wet first? We'll do wet on wet first. So here, I'm going to wet this little area here where the shadow is going to be. Don't worry about this spot, it'll go away. Okay. And then we're going to do some blue. Look how beautiful that is. So pretty. I want it to be a little more intense, so I'm gonna... That's the thing with watercolor too. You're not gonna have exactly the colors that you see in real life. So feel free to exaggerate the colors a little bit. And you see, because I did wet on wet, these edges are gonna be soft. And I'm not gonna continue layering over the shadow because it's on a surface and I wanna tell people that it is on a surface. So I wanna keep my edges soft like that. I wanna keep them a little harder on the orange so that people know that this is the subject and that's the shadow. But it is a little darker where it sits on the surface, and also I told you that we saw a little bit of orange in the shadow, so while it's still wet, I'm gonna drop a little bit in. It's called dropping in color. And just let that do like that. I'm gonna dry with the hairdryer, be right back. Okay, that layer is 100% dry, so I'm gonna take my smaller number 3 brush And I'm going to go just with the ultramarine blue, and I'm going to, right where I see where it sits on the surface, and I'm gonna just kind of clean this up. So watch this, because this is a way to clean up your lines a little bit if you want to. So I put this down, and this is wet on dry, but I wet my brush again, and then I soften this edge a little bit. Right up to the edge here. You don't want to do too much scrubbing. I'm just going with straight clear water, and I'm just kind of softening and blending out. Okay, and then the last little detail you can do, I'll do a mixture of ultramarine blue and orange, and I'll do this little thing that's up here. And I do see a little bit of color variation around it. So let's see here if we can kind of do this. Where it dips in a little bit. And again, soften. Okay. So you see how you've created texture with the texture of the paper. Also, we've layered only 2 colors, and we created all these beautiful values in here. And then we have our beautiful shadow at the edge. So thank you for painting with me. I hope you got something out of this, and I hope you check out my other classes. Thanks again. See you later.